Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animation not made by the mouse. I'm your host, Octaviano, and today I'll be doing another episode that's focused on a show entirely, not a specific episode. Yeah, it's not going to be something where it's much more clear and direct. You guys know the drill. Shows. Lots of great ones. Lots of newer shows tend to be more serialized. This is the thing that's a result of the popularity and, of course, streaming. Of course, it's also a result of people getting into anime and other stuff where it's like, okay, let's have this big ongoing story. Let's have each episode matter. And as a result, the episodes that don't normally matter are labeled as filler. And personally, I think that sucks, because there are a lot of good shows that didn't have this full-on direct story. A while back, I did the episode on Samurai Jack, and that was a show where it's like, yeah, there was a main goal throughout the show, but it wasn't just focused on doing this big, long, serialized story until pretty much the final season, which was understandable. They wanted to wrap things up, and it was, of course, a big story. But generally speaking, I just prefer that a lot of shows be free to explore what these characters are, who they, what the world is like, and, you know, all that stuff. So I don't really get too hung up on, like, oh, does each episode matter in the grand scheme of things. The only time that ever becomes a real annoyance for me is when it's stuff that is like, yeah, no real reason to do a filler if each episode is going to be this big important thing, and then out of nowhere you got this one episode where it's like it doesn't even matter. So it's like, you know, when it comes to the ones where it's like a weird one-off, or in some cases where it interrupts the flow of the story. I think one of the shows that was very notorious for that was Steven Universe, where I'd get invested in this big story and then they'd have these random episodes in between the big story pieces, and I'm like, look, normally I don't mind that, but, you know, you can't just leave me hanging with like, oh, what's going on in this story, and then I don't know, where it's just some nonsensical story. Like, you know, get that important stuff done before you start doing the nonsensical story. Or, you know, if you're gonna break it off like that, at least make the in between, like, you know, make it feel like, okay, this is why it's okay, you know. But yeah, that's my general feeling on a lot of that. It is kind of funny to see a show in the streaming age that is just intentionally mocking it, even though it's kind of doing it, but also it kind of doesn't matter. And the show I'm talking about is Solar Opposites. Before we get started, I just want to say, if you're listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe to the channel, feel free to comment, and ring the bell for notifications. Also, if you're on Spotify or just any other podcast site, follow this show on those platforms. So for those of you unaware, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's a lot, even though it seems to be pretty popular, Solar Opposites is a show that's on Hulu. It's currently on its 5th season. It's been renewed for a 6th season, so it isn't something that has no popularity. It's just something that I feel like has gone under the radar a bit, just because I don't see it advertised all that often, and I don't see a lot of people talking about it, even though it's been pretty consistent. I think it's a pretty enjoyable show. When this came out, it was pretty much marketed as like, oh, from the creator or co-creator, whatever, of Rick and Morty, and yeah, you could tell the art style is similar to Rick and Morty. Early on, they did have Justin Roiland doing the voice of the main character, Corvo. Humor-wise, it's pretty similar. It's a sci-fi show that, you know, is referential to a lot of pop culture, that kind of stuff. Justin Roiland is not involved. The co-creator of the show is more involved than he is. Co-creator Mike McMahon, I hope I'm saying that right, is more involved than Justin Roiland ever was, and the show is still going strong without Justin Roiland. Within the 4th season, because of all the controversy, Justin Roiland was replaced by Dan Stevens, who I think is a lot better as Corvo, because it really just highlights more how much different he is from the family. It's a funny show. I think early on I did kind of dismiss it a little bit, not entirely because I was watching it, but I did kind of dismiss it as like, okay, so this is like the less funny Rick and Morty, because it was Like, yeah, it's doing the sci-fi thing again, which, Rick and Morty already kind of has covered. And it's doing the whole, like, like, hey, we're referencing popular culture stuff, which, again, Rick and Morty was already kind of doing. So it was kind of like, yeah, what's really the point of this show? But it did grow on me. I have consistently come back to watch it every time a new season drops. There are also some specials in between it that aren't necessarily part of the seasons, but come out every now and then. Like, there's a Halloween one, a Christmas one, and a Valentine's Day one. The Christmas one is easily the best one, but they're all fun in their own right. Point being is that the show is really just more like a sitcom. It's pretty much just, here's a family of aliens. The opening pretty much sets it up perfectly, where it's the family of aliens from a planet that died. They landed on Earth just because they have a mission to basically repopulate their world. So Earth is pretty much one of the possible places that they could do it on. They have this little thing called the pupa, which is essentially the baby of the family, who will one day terraform the place, as long as the mission is successful. They get up to shenanigans, and that's generally the show. At least at first. Even within the first season, you already know that this is going to be bigger than what it's supposed to be, because there's a whole running subplot called The Wall within the show, where basically one of the kids on the show, Yumyalak, pretty much shrunk a bunch of humans, either because they're being rude to him, just for petty reasons, just to collect them, whatever. He just takes the small people and puts it in this whole, like, little wall terrarium, and as a result, it becomes this big epic storyline about a bunch of these small people starting to worship the aliens, specifically the other kid, Jessie, because she's nice to them, while creating their own society. And it's very funny stuff. It kind of feels like, in many ways, to me, what Quantumania was trying to do with the whole, quantum realm or whatever, with the small people in the small realm. Only it makes more sense here because it's still within our world. So, you still get a lot of the comedy of, like, hey, look, to us, a toothpick is just a toothpick, but to these small people, a toothpick is like this giant spear or something like that. Like, it does that kind of stuff. And it becomes this big, long, epic storyline that still goes on to this day with different things where it's like different societies have taken over. They're now outside the wall, but they're still a small society. It's all kinds of funny stuff, and it's, just a nice breather from it. And on top of that, there is an eventual other sub-series within the show that started within, I believe, the third season, where the Solar Opposites, and they even refer to themselves as the Solar Opposites, decided to launch this guy to space because he was a dick. So they're like, okay, let's follow where that guy goes. And it's this whole thing where, he's involved with these people called the Silver Cops, and it's, again, another story of revenge, but it's this one's more sci-fi thing, which you would think would make it feel redundant, but because it's a human now in a place where it's full of aliens, it becomes this really kind of funny, contrast to the main storyline. And it's more about, like, okay, his journey from trying to get revenge while becoming a better person. Honestly, at this point, if they ever resolve the storyline, I doubt he's actually going to get revenge on the Solar Opposites. If anything, he's probably going to thank him or something. I don't know. Maybe he still just gets revenge on them just because. But that's generally what the show is. It's just sitcom, but there is this stuff building towards it. And on top of all that, every now and then they do have, like, these big story changes. I won't go into too many of them, but it is kind of funny that even within the first season, they were kind of telling you, like, yeah, we're not too focused on the lore and whatnot. Like, yeah, it is a thing that's in there, but we don't really give a shit. Because within the first season, like, the season finale pretty much ended with all these big reveals, like, oh, this is where the second season is going to go, only to end up revealing, oh yeah, that was just all, bullshit that the characters were essentially creating in a machine that was just a bunch of, like, imaginations of things just to basically set up, like, oh yeah, this is what's gonna happen soon, but not really. So it even mocks the very idea of, like, hey, let's do this big serialized story and then let's set up more serialized stories. But like I said, the charming thing is that as the story goes along, it does kind of acknowledge some of that stuff, but it just never goes too deep with it, so it never feels like it does that perfect line of like, yeah, this is doing like a connected story, but it's not really focused about that. It's not like, you do not need to watch season 3 to fully understand season 5. Like, it's, there are little things that help, especially when it comes to like the sub stories, but if you skipped out on it, they kind of catch you up enough to where you can get what's going on. I feel like the only one that is a little bit harder to follow is the Wall, because that's much more dependent on the long story arc. But what's amusing to me about that is that it still always kind of feels like it's just kind of mocking the very idea of like these serious dramas on TV that have these long story arcs, because they kind of even joke about like, yeah, we pretty much we got rid of one dictator, then the next one took over, then the next one took over, and it's like we kind of went through it. Now in this newest season, they finally got away from that bullshit. So it's like now it's a different thing, but it's still the same old struggles. So yeah, all this stuff makes for a very fun, rewatchable show with all the elements of like, okay, it's not really focused on the lore, but there is a continuity, but we're not really making that the focus of the show. But we do have some sub storylines, like, like some, basically B and C stories that pretty much focus on that stuff. It results in it kind of mattering, but also kind of not mattering. It's weird. But it works to Solar Opposites' favor. When I started watching this, it kind of reminded me of Matt Groening's Netflix show, Disenchantment, where I was just like, yeah, I mean, this is fine, but it's kind of like the lesser version of the big popular show that it's clearly, not a spinoff, but like, like it's clearly owes its existence towards. And of course, with Disenchantment, it would be like Futurama and The Simpsons. With this, it would be Rick and Morty. That being said, whereas Disenchantment slowly just kept on floundering because it kept on, for me at least, missing the point where the show was too convoluted in terms of its storyline, and it would constantly go into circles where it'd be like, okay, we are exploring these new ideas, but we are going back to the status quo. This show really just grew and flourished and just really impressed me over time, just because it was like, yeah, it's constantly avoiding doing real changes towards the main storyline, but at the same time, it doesn't ignore that growth is a thing. Like, if something happens that makes them grow as characters, it stays there throughout the show. Unless they joke about, like, yeah, we're now back at, square one or whatever. And that's very noticeable even within the 5th season, where it starts off right after the events of the 4th season. And at the start of it, it's like, okay, yeah, we're now doing this new planet because we have to leave Earth, only for it to go back to, resetting to just being an Earth thing, just because they're like, well, that's what we know how to do things. Like I said, it is charming because it's like, yeah, I'm now on the 5th season, and I'm like, yeah, I'm very entertained. I'm willing to see a 6th season. Disenchantment, I think by the time we got to the 3rd season, I just got tired of it because it's like you're going around in circles. There's no real growth, even though they kind of have this illusion of like, oh yeah, like, this big thing happens in the end of the season to set up the next season, which again, Solar Opposites was making fun of. Only difference is that with Disenchantment, despite all that build up to like, oh, this big thing is gonna happen in the next season, once you would get back, you'd realize like, oh, it's doing the same thing that it was already doing. So nothing really changed. Nothing really matters. Why are we doing this? Solar Opposites, I think, does it well to, not entirely change it for longtime fans, but at the same time, provide some possible changes to the core cast and story if necessary. So what started off as Rick and Morty, the other show from the Rick and Morty guy, Ended up becoming a thing that I just continued watching. At first, I was like, yeah, it's good, but it's fine. It's not really great because the sci-fi stuff is already covered by Rick and Morty. To now, I'm just like, yeah, Rick and Morty has that sci-fi stuff, and in the end, Rick and Morty is probably the better show in terms of like some much stronger episodes. In the long run, this is working a little bit better just because that they're not trying to build up to like this whole like, oh, we're gonna sympathize with Corvo or whatever, and not that it's wrong to necessarily sympathize with Rick, but at a certain point, it's like, okay, well, this guy's done all these horrible things. It continuously makes it harder to sympathize with him, in a way that that the show still matters to me. Like at a certain point, it just feels like you kind of already sold as much as you could with this with his emotional baggage. Can we please just start moving on from this? I feel like the recent season, for example, for Rick and Morty, while good, and I think the way they went about it, while more understandable in terms of replacing Justin Roiland, I feel like they were the ones who did it kind of weaker just because they just decided, like, okay, let's get a guy who sounds close enough to him. And again, it works well enough, but you can tell that the energy isn't there. Versus with Solar Opposites, where Dan Stevens is clearly not even trying to be Justin Roiland, but it works because, like, okay, well, he's allowing himself to become the character rather than him trying to be someone else who was that character, if that makes sense. But yeah, like, I just feel like I'm more interested in watching more Solar Opposites than I am on more Rick and Morty. And again, it's not even a knock on Rick and Morty. I do think that in some respects it is the better show. It just feels like Solar Opposites has made enough of its own identity at this point that even though it is a sci-fi comedy show, in a similar vein, it does feel like its own thing now, and it does feel like it's stronger for that. Some personal favorites for me when it comes to Solar Opposites. Anytime the wall is brought up is always fun. I do feel like within the last season, it was kind of getting to that point where it's like, okay, this is going nowhere. It wisely chose to do something great, where it decided, like, okay, let's go beyond the wall now, let's have the outside society, which definitely made this season much more interesting. It was a lot better to focus on new characters for it. The space cop stuff is kind of fun, but I'm not gonna lie, that's probably still the weakest one of the three main stories. I do feel it is still a really good storyline to follow. But the main cast, like, man, there's some really funny stuff. Like in this recent season, there's a whole homage to like old Looney Tunes that I think is just great. But the show has plenty of gems. Like even in its first season, there was like Terry and Corvo create a man cave and eventually create like a wife bot to make it more fun. And the wife bot is pretty much just being a nagging wife. I thought that was really funny, and it's still one of the more memorable episodes that I can think of. I mean, with Solar Opposites, one of the things that I do think is underappreciated is just how good it is as an LGBT show. Because you have the two main characters, the adults pretty much, Terry and Corvo being a gay couple, who, yeah, the show kind of establishes, like, gender isn't really the same thing when it comes to their species as it is to humans. That being said, they do go up front and say that, yeah, they're essentially males, and the way they're acting is pretty much gay. Like, they are a gay married couple. And it never just feels like, okay, we're trying to pat ourselves on the back for creating this. It always just feels like, yeah, this is an actual couple, and it's just more fun for it, because it's like, whereas when it comes to a lot of, the kids animation shows, which I see a lot of the animation fans on like Twitter or Reddit or whatever often uphold as like the prime examples of how you can do this stuff, it's always like, yeah, but that always feels like they're just like, not that it's not necessarily bad, but it always just feels like, okay, we're inching towards it, but we're not gonna go deep enough to upset parents. But we do go deep enough to say, like, yeah, they are a gay couple. Sometimes they go a little further, but it's not a very often. This is one where it just feels like, yeah, we're fully gay. Who gives a shit if your parents approve or not? Because this is not a kid's show. So I love it for that reason. I can't think of much else, really. And that may just be because I am a little tired and exhausted right now, but I can't think too much about solar opposites right now. I will say if I do have any more ideas talking about it, maybe on specific episodes, I will eventually do that in the future. As a summary of the show, I think it's fun. It does start off as a little weak, like it's a weaker Rick and Morty, but I feel like as it went along, it definitely grew more and more on me, just because it evolved from just being another Rick and Morty to just being its own show. It's just a sitcom of aliens that happens to be by the Rick and Morty people, or was, or whatever. Point being is it's worthwhile. It's definitely worth checking out. Like I said, someday in the future, if I want to talk more about it, I'll probably talk more in depth on a specific episode. But we'll see. In any case, this has been Octaviano Macias, the host of I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again next time.
Hey, does Corvo sound a little off?
This thing must not be calibrated. Let me try again. No!
Thanks for stopping by. Go ahead and follow this channel. Subscribe, like and comment, ring the bell for notifications. Go ahead and also follow my podcast and give some love to my Patreon account while you're at it. It's www.patreon.com/saicams. Again, thanks for stopping by, and I hope you come back for more in the future.